I've been feeding the same Bigfoot since 1986, and what he finally showed me about why his kind is scared of humans is something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Some people might call me crazy for saying this out loud, but after keeping this secret for almost 40 years, I believe it's time the world knows the truth. My name is Thomas McKenna. I'm 66 years old, and I'm a retired forest ranger from the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. This is my story, and I need to tell it exactly as it happened because what I learned changes everything we think we know about these creatures. The fall of 1986 turned the forests of the Pacific Northwest into colors of orange and red. I was 28 years old back then, a new forest ranger, fresh out of the forestry school at Oregon State University and eager to do a good job in my first real position. I grew up in Portland and spent my summers camping with my dad in the Cascades. This gave me a deep respect for nature that eventually became my job. The cool October air smelled like pine trees and old leaves as I walked through the thick woods that important day. It was supposed to be just another normal patrol, checking trail signs, writing down animal activity, the usual tasks. My boss, an old and experienced ranger named Bill Henderson, had warned me about how lonely the job could be when I first started. Out here, you're on your own most of the time, Bill had said. His rough hands held a coffee mug in the ranger station. The radio only works in certain spots. If you see something strange, write it down. But don't go looking for trouble. These woods have been here longer than any of us, and they have their secrets. I had nodded, thinking Bill was just being dramatic. After all, what could possibly happen? I was trained for emergencies, knew how to handle meeting wild animals, and had studied every rule in the Ranger Handbook. I was ready for bears, mountain lions, and even the occasional lost hiker. What I wasn't ready for was what happened on October 15th, 1986. It was late afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., and the sun was already starting to go down behind the tall Douglas fir trees. I was checking on reports of broken property at an old hunting cabin about 6 miles from the main trail. The cabin belonged to a local family who used it during deer season, and they reported finding their storage shed torn apart and food scattered everywhere. As I walked toward the open space where the cabin sat, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The damage wasn't normal for bears. I'd seen plenty of bear damage during my training. This was different. The shed's door hadn't just been scratched open. It had been pulled off its hinges with what must have been amazing strength. Large, deep marks in the soft dirt around the building caught my attention. I knelt down to look at them more closely, pulling out my measuring tape and camera. The prints were huge, at least 17 inches long and 7 inches wide at the widest part. They were shaped like a human foot with 5 clear toe marks, but they were far too big to be human. The depth of the marks suggested something incredibly heavy, probably weighing between 600 and 800 pounds based on my guess. My heart began to beat fast. In all my training, and in all the wildlife books I'd studied, nothing quite matched what I was seeing. Bears left claw marks. These prints showed no claws, just wide, flat marks that looked disturbingly like giant human feet. I spent the next hour writing everything down, taking photos from many angles, making plaster molds of the best prints, measuring the step length an amazing 6 feet between steps, and drawing the scene in my notebook. The professional part of my brain was recording facts, but another part, a deep instinct, was screaming at me to leave. The forest had become unnaturally quiet. There were no bird songs, no sounds of small animals in the bushes, just a spooky silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I had read about this, how animals would go silent when a major predator was near. My hand moved automatically to the bear spray on my belt. That's when I heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A low, deep voice sound that seemed to vibrate through the trees themselves. Not quite a growl, not quite a howl, but something in between. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, maybe 100 yards away. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct told me to run, but my training kicked in. I slowly backed toward my truck, which was parked on the dirt road about 50 yards from the cabin. My eyes scanned the edge of the trees, looking for any sign of movement. My camera hung around my neck. My notepad was held tight in one hand, and the other hovered near my bear spray. Then I saw it. Between two massive cedar trees, partly hidden by shadow and bushes, stood a figure. At first, my brain tried to explain it as a person in a dark coat, maybe another hiker. But as my eyes adjusted and the figure moved slightly, that explanation fell apart. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to soak up the fading light. It had wide shoulders that would make a professional football player look small. And it was watching me. I froze. Every safety rule for wild animals I'd ever learned suddenly seemed useless. This wasn't in any manual. This wasn't supposed to exist. The creature, and my mind finally accepted that's what it was, didn't move in an angry way. It simply stood there, partly hidden, watching. I could see a face, though not clearly in the shadows. It had dark eyes that reflected a little bit of the remaining daylight, and a high ridge on top of its head. Similar to what I'd seen in pictures of gorillas, but bigger. Time seemed to stop. Later, I couldn't say if we stood there staring at each other for 30 seconds or 3 minutes. My photographer's instinct screamed at me to raise my camera to record this impossible moment. But my hands wouldn't work. They stayed frozen, one holding my notebook, the other still hovering uselessly near my bear spray. The creature made another sound, softer this time, almost curious. Then, with a movement so fast and smooth it seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps and breaking branches, getting quieter as whatever I'd seen moved away. I didn't remember getting into my truck. The next thing I clearly remembered was sitting behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove back to the ranger station in a fog, my mind racing with what I had seen. When I arrived at the station just after sunset, Bill was still there, finishing up some paperwork. The older ranger took one look at my pale face and immediately poured me a cup of coffee from the pot that seemed to be always brewing. "You look like you've seen a ghost, kid," Bill said, sitting in the chair across from me. "What happened out there?" I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? Bill would think I was crazy or worse, that I couldn't handle the loneliness of the job. I'd be moved to a different job, maybe even fired. All my dreams of being a forest ranger would disappear because I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. Just had a close call with what might have been a bear, I finally said, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. Oh, got spooked. I'm fine now. Bill studied me for a long moment, his gray eyes sharp despite his age. That cabin damage, you write it down? Yeah, I said, happy to change the subject. I pulled out my camera and notebook, took photos and measurements, made some molds of prints. They're unusual. Might be a large bear, but the prints don't quite match any bear signs I've seen before. Bill flipped through the notebook, his face showing no emotion. He looked at the measurements, the drawings, and the detailed notes I had made. When he got to the description of the prints, 17 inches long, shaped like a human, no claw marks, he went very still. These measurements accurate? Bill asked quietly. Yes, sir. Triple-check them. Bill closed the notebook and handed it back to me. File your report. Write down everything you saw. But Thomas, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Out here in these woods, sometimes we see things that don't fit neatly into what we learned in school. The best thing to do is write it down professionally and keep an open mind. There was something in Bill's tone that made me look up quickly. The older ranger's face was carefully calm, but his eyes held something else. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. Have you ever? I started to ask, then stopped myself. Bill stood up, stretching his back with a loud crack. I've been a ranger in these woods for 32 years, kid. I've seen a lot of things. Some of them made it into official reports. Some of them didn't. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Get some rest. And Thomas, if you ever see something unusual again, you can talk to me, just between us. After Bill left, I sat alone in the station, staring at my notebook. The official report I'd have to file wouldn't mention what I'd really seen. It would be about property damage and unusual tracks, possibly from a large bear. But in my personal journal, locked in my desk drawer, I wrote down every detail of my meeting while it was still fresh in my mind. I described the creature's size, its movements, and the way it had watched me with what seemed like intelligence rather than animal curiosity. I drew what I'd seen, trying to capture the shape of its face, the width of its shoulders, and the way it had moved through the forest with impossible grace, despite its size. That night, lying in my small cabin on the ranger station grounds, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the forest seemed louder, every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves. But it wasn't fear that kept me awake. Not entirely. It was something else. Wonder. Whatever I'd seen out there, it was real. It lived in these forests, living its life in the shadows, avoiding human contact. And somehow, for just a few minutes, I had been allowed to see it. I didn't know it then, but that October evening would change the entire path of my life. The creature I'd seen, the one that wasn't supposed to exist, the one that lived only in legends and campfire stories, would become the focus of the next 38 years of my life. And in that time, I would learn its secrets. I would discover why it hid from humans with such determination. And that knowledge would break my heart. For 3 weeks after that first meeting, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Every spare moment, I found myself pulling out my field notebook, studying the drawings I'd made, and reviewing the measurements of those impossible footprints. The plaster molds sat on my desk like proof of something the logical part of my brain still wanted to deny. I threw myself into research, During my days off, I drove to the University of Washington Library in Seattle, spending hours in the sections about human history and animals. I read every book I could find about Pacific Northwest wildlife, Native American stories, and yes, even the weird materials about Bigfoot sightings. What I found was a mix of obvious fakes, real mysteries, and Native American traditions that spoke of Sasquatch. Wild men of the woods who avoided human contact, the Lummi, Snoqualmie, and other coastal tribes had stories going back generations about these creatures. They weren't monsters in their traditions. They were beings to be respected, avoided, and left alone. They keep to themselves, one account I read stated. They don't want our world, and we shouldn't want theirs. But I did want to know more, not to catch or expose the creature, but something deeper than that. I wanted to understand. What was it doing in those woods? Was it alone? How had it remained hidden for so long? And most importantly, would I ever see it again? The answer came on November 7th, 1986. I had started changing my patrol routes to take me past that hunting cabin more often. Not every day. I didn't want to create an obvious pattern that might draw questions from Bill or the other rangers. But 2 or 3 times a week, I'd find a real reason to be in that area, checking on winter preparations, writing down pre-snow conditions, watching for early season hunters who might be trespassing. It was a gray Friday afternoon, the kind of day where the clouds hung so low they seemed to touch the treetops. A light rain had been falling since morning, turning the forest floor into a carpet of wet leaves that made everything quiet. I was about half a mile from the cabin, looking at some elk tracks, when I heard the sound again. That same low, deep voice sound that had frozen my blood 3 weeks earlier. But this time, I didn't run. My heart hammered in my chest. Energy flooded my body, but I stayed put. Slowly, carefully, I stood up from where I'd been crouching. My hand went to the bear spray on my belt, but I didn't pull it out. Instead, I just stood there, waiting. The sound came again, closer this time, maybe 50 yards away from a thick patch of young fir trees and blackberry bushes. I could hear something large moving through the bushes, breaking branches, causing the wet leaves to rustle. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet forest. I felt silly talking to what might be the wind or a bear, but something in my gut told me to try. "I'm just here doing my job. I'm not a threat." The movement stopped. The forest went silent except for the soft sound of rain on leaves. Then slowly the branches parted, and there it was again. In the gray daylight, even through the rain and mist, I could see it much more clearly than during that first evening meeting. The creature stood at the edge of the bushes about 40 yards away, partly hidden, but clearly visible. It was every bit as huge as I remembered, probably 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders that must have been 4 feet across. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, longer around the shoulders and head, shorter on the arms and chest. The face was both human and not human. A wide flat nose, a heavy bone ridge over the eyes, and lips that were bigger than a gorilla's but less than a human's. And the eyes, dark, smart eyes that watched me with what I can only describe as careful curiosity. We stood there in the rain, looking at each other. I noticed details I'd missed in the panic of the first meeting. The creature's hands were huge with thick fingers and what looked like fingernails rather than claws. Its feet, partly visible in the bushes, matched the prints I'd cast, wide, flat, and, surprisingly, like human feet in structure. It was breathing heavily, its massive chest rising and falling. I could see the rain beating on its hair, rolling off in streams. It seemed to be judging me, trying to decide something. Very slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, I lowered myself to a sitting position on a fallen log. I wanted to look safe, to show I wasn't going to chase or attack. I kept my hands visible, away from the bear spray. "I saw you before," I said quietly, not sure if speaking was helping or hurting. "At the cabin. I've been hoping I'd see you again." The creature's head tilted slightly, reminding me, strangely, of a dog trying to understand human speech. Could it understand my words, or was it just responding to the tone of my voice? I reached slowly into my jacket pocket and pulled out an apple, part of my lunch that I hadn't eaten. Without making any angry movements, I gently tossed it onto the ground about halfway between us. "I don't know if you eat these," I said, "but if you do, you're welcome to it." For a long moment, nothing happened. The creature stared at the apple, then at me, then back at the apple. I could almost see the thinking process happening. Was this a trick? A trap? What did this strange human want? Then, with movements that were surprisingly smooth for something so large, it moved forward. Not all the way to the apple. It stopped, about 10 feet from it. Then, it did something I never expected. It made a sound again, but differently this time. Not the low, deep sound from before, but a series of shorter sounds, almost like clicks or soft grunts. It was communicating something, though I had no idea what. "I don't understand," I admitted. "But I'm listening." The creature reached down, and I realized for the first time that it had been carrying something from the bushes where it had come out. It picked up what looked like a branch, with several bunches of huckleberries still attached. With a movement that was clearly done on purpose, it placed the branch on the ground, then stepped back. My breath caught. It was giving back. I had offered food, and it was offering food in return. "Thank you," I said, my voice cracking slightly. Thank you." We stayed like that for what must have been 10 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter. The creature eventually reached forward, grabbed the apple with surprising speed, and moved back toward the bushes. It didn't eat the apple immediately. Instead, it held it, looking at it, bringing it to its nose to smell it. Then, with one last long look at me, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I heard it moving away, the sound of it leaving, fading, until there was nothing but rain and wind. I sat there on that log for another 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally stood up, my legs were shaky. I walked to where the creature had left the huckleberry branch and carefully picked it up. The berries were fresh, perfectly ripe. I ate one. It was sweet and delicious. That night, I added another entry to my private journal, writing down every detail of the meeting. But I also started a new section, a log of interactions, because I knew somehow that this wouldn't be the last time. I was right. Over the next 3 months, I met the creature 6 more times. Never at the same place, never at the same time of day, but always in roughly the same area of the forest, a territory of maybe 4 or 5 square miles around that hunting cabin. The pattern that showed up was fascinating. The creature seemed to be watching my movements, keeping track of when and where I patrolled. Sometimes I'd hear it before I'd see it, that special voice sound that I was beginning to recognize. Other times, I'd simply feel watched and would catch a glimpse of it, watching from a distance. I started bringing gifts every time I patrolled that area. Apples, granola bars, sometimes sandwich leftovers from my lunch. I'd leave them on stumps or rocks in places where I'd seen signs of the creature being there. They were always gone by my next patrol, and the creature left things in return. Not every time, but often enough that I recognized it was done on purpose. Interesting stones, pine cones arranged in small piles, once a perfect bird's nest that had fallen from a tree. It was trying to communicate, to build some kind of connection. By late January 1987, something remarkable happened. I was on patrol, had just left one of my usual gifts, a couple of protein bars and an orange, when I heard movement behind me. I turned slowly, and there it was, less than 20 feet away. But this time, it didn't keep its distance. It moved closer, stopping about 10 feet from me. Close enough that I could see the texture of its hair, the way its chest moved with each breath, and the incredible detail of its face. We looked at each other, and I saw something in its eyes that changed everything. Not just intelligence, I'd already recognized that, but something deeper. Sadness, maybe tiredness born of experience. This wasn't just an animal trying to figure out if I was a threat. This was a thinking being, one that had learned to fear my kind, trying to decide if I was different. "I won't hurt you," I said softly, "and I won't tell anyone about you. You have my word." I don't know if it understood my words, but it seemed to understand my intent. It reached down, picked up the protein bars carefully, almost gently, despite its massive hands, and made a sound. Not the warning sound, not the curious clicks. Something else. Something that sounded almost like thanks. Then it did something that brought tears to my eyes. It reached out one huge hand and gently touched a nearby tree trunk, then looked at me and touched its own chest. It was showing me something. The forest was its home. Its chest was itself. It was telling me who it was in relation to this place. I copied the gesture, touching the tree, then my own chest. "This is your home," I said. "I understand. I'll respect that." The creature watched me for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. But before it disappeared into the trees, it looked back once. And I could have sworn, I know this sounds impossible, but I could have sworn it was making sure I was still there, still watching. That was the moment everything changed. That was when a simple forest ranger's curiosity became something more. A commitment, a promise, a friendship. If such a thing could exist between species so different, yet somehow not different at all. I had no idea then that this relationship would last for decades. I had no idea that I would eventually learn this creature's story, understand its fears, and discover the dark truth about what humans had done to drive its kind into hiding. All I knew in that moment was that I had been trusted with something precious, a secret, a connection to something the world thought didn't exist. And I was determined to protect it, no matter what it cost me. The years that followed taught me patience I never knew I had, building trust with a creature that had every reason to fear humans wasn't a matter of weeks or months. It was years of consistent, careful interaction. By the spring of 1987, I had established a routine. 3 times a week, I'd make my way to what I'd begun thinking of as our territory, that 5-square-mile area of forest where the creatures seemed to live. I'd bring food, always different things: fresh fruits, vegetables, nuts, sometimes dried meats or fish. I learned through trying different things what it preferred. Apples were always a hit, and berries of any kind. It seemed to especially enjoy salmon, which wasn't surprising since we were in the Pacific Northwest. I'd leave the gifts in specific locations, and over time, the creature began meeting me at these spots. Not every time, but more and more often. Sometimes it would watch from a distance. Other times it would approach, take the food, and leave something in return. Always these small gifts, interesting rocks, shells from the river. Once a perfect set of deer antlers it must have found. But the real breakthrough came in June of that year. I had arrived at one of our usual meeting spots, a small clearing near a creek that ran through the forest. I'd brought a bag full of apples, some carrots, and a large salmon I'd caught that morning in the Columbia River. I was arranging the food on a flat rock when I heard the now familiar sound of heavy footsteps. Coming closer, the creature walked out from the edge of the trees, but this time it wasn't alone. My heart nearly stopped. Behind the large male I'd been meeting with, I decided it was male based on its size and build, was a smaller figure. Still large by human standards, maybe 7 feet tall, with slightly reddish-brown fur instead of dark brown. It stayed back, partly hidden behind the larger creature, watching me with obvious nervousness. "You brought someone," I said softly, keeping my voice calm despite my racing heart. "That's okay. There is plenty of food." The larger creature, I'd started thinking of him as Old Jack, though I never said the name aloud, made a series of soft sounds toward the smaller one. It sounded almost like encouragement or comfort. The communication between them was clear, even if I couldn't understand the specific words. Slowly, Old Jack walked to the rock where I laid out the food. He picked up the salmon, his favorite, but instead of eating it or taking it away, he turned and offered it to the smaller creature. A female, I realized, watching the interaction. His mate, perhaps, or a sister. She walked up carefully, eyes never leaving me. When she was about 15 feet away, Old Jack made another soft sound, and she quickly took the salmon from his hands and moved back toward the trees. But she didn't leave entirely. She stayed at the edge of the open space, watching as Old Jack gathered up some of the apples and carrots. Before he left, Old Jack did something he'd never done before. He sat down right there in the clearing, about 20 feet from where I stood. He began eating one of the apples, watching me as he did so. I understood what he was doing. He was showing the female that I was safe, that this human could be trusted. It was the biggest sign of trust he'd shown me yet. I sat down too, on a log on my side of the clearing, and we ate together in friendly silence while I ate an energy bar from my pack while he worked through 3 apples. The female eventually came close enough to grab a few carrots before moving back again. That day marked a turning point. Over the following months, I met the female several more times. She was more skittish than Old Jack, always keeping her distance. But she was getting used to my presence, and I began to understand something important. These creatures had a social structure, relationships, possibly even families. As 1987 turned into 1988 and then 1989, my relationship with Old Jack deepened in ways I never could have expected. He began showing me things, not just accepting food, but actually trying to communicate more complex ideas. One day in the fall of 1989, he led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone in that area. I followed at a respectful distance, curious but careful. We walked for maybe 20 minutes before we came to a small cave, barely visible behind a curtain of hanging moss and ferns. Old Jack stopped at the entrance and motioned toward it. An unmistakable "look at this" motion. I walked up slowly and looked inside. The cave was small, maybe 10 feet deep, but dry and safe. And inside were things that made me hold my breath. Carefully arranged piles of food, nuts, dried berries, roots, a bed of soft ferns and moss, and, most surprising of all, tools. Crude but unmistakable rocks that had been shaped for specific jobs, sticks worn smooth from use. "This is your home," I said, looking back at Old Jack. "You're showing me where you live." He made a soft sound, one I'd come to recognize as yes. But there was something else in his eyes, something that looked almost like vulnerability. He was trusting me with his biggest secret, where he was most open to danger, where he slept, where he kept his supplies. I backed away from the cave entrance immediately. "Thank you for showing me," I said. "I won't tell anyone, and I'll never come here without you. You have my word." Over the next several years, our bond continued to grow. I learned to read his sounds, to understand the small differences in tone that meant different things. He learned to recognize my vehicle's engine sound and would often be waiting when I arrived. We developed our own form of communication, part sound, part gesture, part feeling. By 1995, I had been meeting with Old Jack for 9 years. In that time, I'd seen the female. I'd started thinking of her as Sarah, though again just in my mind, dozens of times. I'd seen what I believed were dating behaviors between them. I'd seen Old Jack bring her gifts of food, seen them sit together at the edge of clearings while I left gifts. And then in the spring of 1995, something incredible happened. I arrived at one of our meeting spots to find Old Jack waiting. But he was upset. He was pacing back and forth, making sounds I'd never heard before. Urgent, almost worried. My first thought was that he was injured or that Sarah was hurt. "What's wrong?" I asked, immediately worried. "Are you okay? Is Sarah okay?" He moved toward me, then away, then back again. He was trying to get me to follow him. Without hesitating, I did. He led me on a path through the forest, moving faster than usual, but checking back frequently to make sure I was keeping up. We walked for maybe 15 minutes before he brought me to a small group of cedar trees, and there, hidden in a nest of ferns and moss, was Sarah, and in her arms, barely visible against her reddish fur, was the smallest Bigfoot I'd ever seen. A baby. They had a baby. I stopped dead in my tracks, overwhelmed by feeling. Sarah looked at me with eyes that held both protectiveness and something else. Perhaps the hope that I would react the right way to this moment. "Oh my God," I whispered. "You have a baby." The baby couldn't have been more than a few days old. Its eyes were barely open, and it held onto Sarah with tiny hands that were perfect small copies of its parents. Its fur was lighter than both parents, almost golden brown. Old Jack moved to stand between me and his family, not angrily, but protectively. He made a soft sound, and I understood what he was saying. "Look, but don't come closer." "I understand," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Congratulations, both of you. This is wonderful." I stood there for maybe 10 minutes just watching from a respectful distance as Sarah held her baby and old Jack stood guard. Then, understanding that I'd been shown something holy, something private, I slowly backed away. Before I left, old Jack followed me a short distance. When we were out of hearing range of Sarah and the baby, he did something amazing. He placed one of his massive hands on a tree trunk, then on his chest, the gesture we'd established years ago for home or self. Then he pointed back toward where his family was and made the softest, most gentle sound I'd ever heard from him. He was telling me about his family, about what they meant to him, about love in a language that went beyond species. "I'll protect them," I promised him. "I'll protect all of you always." And I meant it with every part of my being. Over the next months and years, I watched that baby grow. I saw it take its first wobbly steps, watched it learn to look for food, saw old Jack teach it which plants were safe to eat, how to catch fish from the streams. It was like being given a window into a world that shouldn't exist, a secret that the forest had kept for thousands of years. The young one, I thought of it as little Jack, though I later learned it was actually female, was curious about me in a way her parents never quite were. By the time she was 2 years old, she would come much closer than Sarah ever had, though always under the watchful eyes of her parents. But as the years passed, I began to notice something worrying. Old Jack was showing signs of bad memories I hadn't recognized before. Sometimes, when I'd arrive for our meetings, I'd find him upset, pacing, making unhappy sounds. He'd lead me to areas of the forest where there were signs of human activity, old campsites, trash that had been left behind, once even a hunting stand that had been built in a tree. He was showing me people entering his territory. And more than that, he seemed to be trying to tell me something about humans, about why he and his kind stayed hidden, about what had made them so scared. It would take many more years before I understood the full truth, before old Jack finally revealed to me the dark reason why Bigfoot avoids humans with such determination. But by the late 1990s, I knew I was on the edge of discovering something deep and sad. Something that would change everything I thought I knew about the relationship between humans and these amazing creatures. The year 2000 brought changes to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. More hikers, more tourists, more people looking for escape in the wilderness that had once been relatively lonely. For me, now in my early 40s and a senior ranger, it meant more patrols, more rules to enforce, and more chances for human Bigfoot meetings that could go terribly wrong. I became very watchful about old Jack's territory, always finding reasons to patrol that area more often. If I saw signs of illegal camping or hunting near where I knew he and his family spent time, I'd shut it down immediately, sometimes making up rules to move people along. My coworkers probably thought I was doing too much, but I didn't care. I had a secret to protect. By 2003, little Jack, who I'd learned was actually female when she grew up, was 8 years old and almost as tall as Sarah. She'd grown comfortable enough with me that she'd sometimes come within arm's reach, though I never tried to touch her. That boundary felt sacred, something that shouldn't be crossed, even after 17 years of trust building. It was during that summer that everything changed. that I finally learned the truth I'd been sensing but couldn't quite grasp. I arrived at our usual meeting spot on a warm July afternoon, carrying a cooler full of fresh salmon and berries. Old Jack was there, but something was wrong. He was sitting on the ground, hunched over, making low pain sounds that I'd never heard before. "Jack," I called out, dropping the cooler and moving toward him without thinking. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" He looked up at me, and what I saw in his eyes stopped me in my tracks. Not physical pain, but something deeper. Emotional pain. Memories coming up that he'd kept buried. He stood slowly, and for the first time in all our years together, he walked up to me directly. He came within 5 feet, closer than he'd ever been, and then did something that made me hold my breath. He turned his back to me and lifted his left arm. His fur, which usually lay smooth and thick, was messy along his left side, and underneath, visible through the thinner hair, were scars, deep, old scars that ran in parallel lines across his ribs and down his back. They were partly hidden by fur that had grown back over them, but once I knew to look, they were unmistakable. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Jack, what happened to you?" He turned back to face me and began to communicate in a way he never had before. Using gestures, sounds, and a form of acting out, he started to tell me his story. He pointed to himself, then held his hand low to the ground, showing he'd been young. Then he held up both hands, fingers spread, representing many. A group, a family. My heart began to sink as I understood. He'd had a family before Sarah, before I met him. He made walking motions with his fingers, showing movement through the forest. Then he stopped and crouched low, making himself small, hiding. He pointed to his eyes, then gestured outward, watching. Then he formed his hands into the shape of a gun. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Hunters," I said. "Hunters found your family." He made a yes sound, but there was such pain in it that tears came to my eyes. He continued his story, showing me through gesture what words couldn't say. His family had been attacked. He'd been young, maybe like a teenager. He'd watched from hiding as hunters. He showed me multiple figures, maybe 4 or 5, had trapped his family. He showed me running, showed me the sound of gunfire by clapping his hands sharply, showed me falling, being wounded. His hand traced along those scars on his side. "You were shot," I said, my voice breaking. "They shot you?" He nodded, a gesture he'd learned from watching me over the years. Then he showed me playing dead, lying still while the hunters came close. He made gestures of the hunters looking at something, talking, arguing maybe, then leaving. He'd survived by pretending to be dead. But his family... Old Jack's massive shoulders shook. He made a sound of such deep sadness that I couldn't help myself. I took a step closer and placed my hand on a nearby tree, the gesture we used for "I'm here." "I understand." He looked at me with eyes full of old pain and continued. He showed me staying hidden, watching from the shadows as more humans came. Different ones this time. He gestured at clothing that looked official, maybe uniforms. They'd taken the bodies away, covered everything up, made it disappear. "That's why you hide," I said, understanding finally washing over me. "That's why all of you hide. Because we hunt you. Because we've always hunted you." He made another yes sound, but then he did something else. He formed his hands into shapes I'd seen before. Small shapes, medium shapes, large shapes. He was showing me different groups. different families. Then he showed them disappearing one by one, getting smaller and fewer. "There aren't many of you left, are there?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He held up both hands, fingers spread, then closed them into fists, opened them again, showing fewer fingers, then fewer, over and over, showing me numbers going down. His kind was disappearing, being hunted, being driven from their homes as humans expanded into every corner of the wild. "How long ago?" I asked. "How long ago did you lose your family?" He showed me seasons passing, the gesture he used for years, once, twice, 3 times. He kept going, 7 times, 8, 9 times. He showed me the cycle of seasons 9 years before I met him. He'd been living alone, hurt, and hiding for nearly 10 years before that day in 1986 when he'd watched me look at the hunting cabin. He'd been watching humans, trying to understand if any of us could be trusted, if any of us were different from the ones who destroyed his family. And somehow, he'd decided to take a chance on me. "I'm so sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face now. "I'm so sorry for what they did to you, for what my species has done to yours." Old Jack made a soft sound and did something he'd never done before. He reached out one massive hand and gently touched my shoulder just for a moment, then pulled back. But in that gesture was forgiveness, understanding, admitting that I was different, that not all humans were the same. He pointed to himself, then to Sarah, and showed me little Jack's size when she was born. He'd found Sarah years after the attack, both of them alone, both survivors. They'd formed a new family, found a way to keep living despite the bad memories and fear. But the scars remained. The memories remained. The terror that drove them deeper into the shrinking wild remained. Over the next several visits, old Jack revealed more. He showed me other signs he'd found in the forest over the years, spent bullet shells, broken equipment, places where others of his kind had been hunted. He led me to a hidden valley deeper in the mountains, where he said others sometimes gathered. A safe place of sorts, though he showed me it was getting harder to reach as roads and buildings crept closer. He showed me photographs. Yes, photographs. Hidden away in a waterproof box in his cave were old newspaper clippings and photos that he'd collected over the years. Proof of his kind being hunted, being shown off as prizes, being treated as monsters instead of intelligent, peaceful beings. The clippings were from the 1960s and 70s, yellow with age, headlines about Bigfoot hunting trips and Sasquatch rewards, photos of men with guns smiling as they posed in the forest. Some of the articles described creatures that had been killed, though the bodies were always mysteriously lost or taken by officials. "They've been hunting you for sport," I said, looking at the evidence he'd carefully saved. "For prizes, for proof, for money." He nodded, then showed me something else. Gestures showing capture, cages, labs. Some of his kind hadn't just been hunted and killed. They'd been captured, taken alive. He didn't know where or by whom, but he knew it had happened. The fear of it was passed down through the remaining families, a terror that kept them awake at night, kept them silent, kept them hidden. I understood then why Bill Henderson had reacted the way he did all those years ago when he'd seen my first report. Why he'd told me some things didn't make it into official records. He'd known. Maybe he'd even seen evidence himself. The government, or parts of it, knew these creatures existed. And for reasons I could only guess at, to prevent panic, to protect business interests, to maintain control over the story. They kept it secret, and in that secrecy, Bigfoot had no protection, no rights, no admission of their existence that might make killing them murder instead of just an unusual form of hunting. "I'll protect you," I promised Old Jack again, but this time with full understanding of what I was protecting them from. "I'll keep your secret. I'll watch over your territory, and I'll teach little Jack to be careful, to be hidden, to survive." He touched my shoulder again, that same gentle gesture. Then he gathered up the newspaper clippings and photos, carefully placing them back in their waterproof box. Evidence of a whole group being wiped out that no one admitted. Proof of a species being killed off while the world pretended they didn't exist. As I left the forest that day, I felt the weight of what I'd learned crushing down on me. For 17 years, I'd been feeding a friend, building a relationship I treasured. But I'd been innocent about what that friendship meant. In the bigger picture, Old Jack hadn't just been accepting my food and company. He'd been teaching me, preparing me to understand, making sure that at least one human knew the truth, so that maybe somehow that truth wouldn't die with him and his kind. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How many were left? How long before they were gone entirely? What could one forest ranger possibly do against the forces that had been hunting them for generations? But I knew one thing for certain. I would do whatever I could for Old Jack, for Sarah, for Little Jack, and for whatever others remained hidden in the deep forests. They deserved to exist. They deserved to be left in peace. And I would spend the rest of my career making sure that in at least this one corner of the wilderness, they would be safe. The years moved on, quiet but heavy. I never spoke of Old Jack's story, not to my wife, not to my closest coworkers, not even to Bill in his final years on duty. It wasn't just secrecy for secrecy's sake. I understood now that speaking their truth carelessly could mean their end. One wrong word, and someone with the wrong intentions could trace my patrol logs, investigate the region, and destroy everything they had left. By the time 2010 arrived, I had spent 24 years guarding that family. 24 years of meeting the same tall figure beneath the cedars, of exchanging gifts, of watching little Jack grow from a curious child into a graceful young adult. Her fur darkened to a deep reddish brown, and she moved with a confidence that could only come from parents who taught her every hidden trail, every freshwater pool, every scent carried by the wind. I watched her learn to fish in the Lewis River just as I'd seen children learn to ride bikes. She slipped silently between mossy rocks, catching salmon with motion so smooth they felt practiced, like art passed down through generations. Old Jack watched from the riverbank, chest forward, proud. Sometimes he'd look toward me as if making sure I was seeing what he saw. Proof that his family line continued despite everything that had tried to erase them. By then, I wasn't just feeding a creature, I was witnessing a legacy. As the world around us changed, new highways, cameras in every hand, more people flooding the wilderness in search of experiences, I began to fear that time was running out. More than once, I convinced hikers to try a different trail, inventing closures or safety hazards to keep them away. A few times, I stopped hunters setting up hiding spots too close to Old Jack's territory. I took their equipment, wrote tickets, even threatened to report them for illegal hunting when no laws technically covered what they were doing. But every year I saw more evidence of people entering. And every year, old Jack grew more tense. Sometimes he'd bring me branches snapped cleanly in half, his signal that strangers had been near. Other times, he would show me marks in the mud, boot prints, and look at me with that same haunted fear that first surfaced when he showed me his scars. One late autumn night, I heard him before I saw him. I'd been hiking in thick fog, headlights from my truck cutting into the quiet. His call came from somewhere beyond the creek, low and shaking. I had never heard him sound afraid for himself, only for others. I hurried toward the sound. The forest was unusually silent. No owls, no insects, just mist, and the quiet hum of distant river water. Old Jack came out from behind a group of Douglas firs, shoulders tense, standing ready. He motioned for me to follow urgently. I'd seen this once before, the day he showed me Little Jack for the first time. My chest tightened. Something was wrong, and we hiked for nearly 20 minutes, deeper than I'd ever gone without his guidance. Even in the fog, he moved confidently, checking behind him often to be sure I kept up. Finally, we reached a clearing I didn't recognize. There, sitting on the ground, was Sarah. Her usually bright eyes looked dull and blurry. She leaned against a fallen log, breathing shallowly, fur sticking to her side, where blood, dark and already drying, was matted through. My stomach dropped. She had been shot. Old Jack lowered himself beside her, making soft, steady sounds. Comfort, support. Little Jack knelt on the other side, her huge hands shaking as she tried to clean the wound with soaked moss. I took careful steps forward. "I'm here, I whispered, though I knew my words meant little. Still, old Jack looked at me with something desperate in his eyes, begging. He trusted me. I knelt, looking at the wound without touching. The bullet had grazed through muscle, high enough to miss organs, low enough to slow her to a crawl. A hunting bullet was still stuck deep inside. Sarah let out a soft noise that sounded almost like an apology. Little Jack's hand brushed her cheek, and in the dim fog-filtered moonlight, I understood I wasn't just seeing an injury. I was seeing fear. Fear grounded in history. Fear of a cycle repeating. Whoever had done this was close, and they would return. I didn't have medical tools, not out here, and even if I had, I'd never done more than help animal doctors in the park with sleepy bears and elk. But I knew infection. I knew wounds. I knew painfully that regular help was not an option. "I need to clean it," I whispered. Old Jack lowered his head in agreement. I got my water bottle, soaked a cloth, and began carefully cleaning the matted fur just to see how bad the bleeding was. Sarah shook with each wipe. I spoke softly, keeping my tone steady. Little Jack watched every movement, absorbing, learning. The bullet was still deep. I didn't dare pull it out. Not with my hands, not here. Removing it could kill her faster. "We have to keep it clean," I said, unsure whether I was reassuring them or myself. "I'll bring supplies, medicine, cleaner." Old Jack made a low, steady sound. Agreement. When I finished, Sarah let out a faint breath. Relief or exhaustion. Little Jack helped adjust a bed of thick ferns beneath her. I placed my hand on the trunk of the cedar beside them, our gesture of promise. "I'll be back before sunrise." I hesitated only one moment before running through the fog, branches slapping against my arms, lungs burning. I reached my truck and drove like a crazy man back to my cabin. If anyone saw me, I had practiced explanations, routine medical emergency, wildlife rescue, anything. But the roads were empty. Inside my cabin, I grabbed everything I had: medical gauze, antibiotic ointment, iodine, pain relievers. I ground into powder a hunting knife, a clean blanket. I turned to leave and froze. My cabin window facing the trees was open. I never left it open. A sheet of notebook paper lay on the counter. At first, I thought it was something I'd left out, maybe a note to myself, but the handwriting wasn't mine. It was bold, heavy strokes, like someone unused to writing. "Don't go back there." My blood ran cold. I checked the locks, unbroken. Nothing stolen, no vehicles outside. But someone had been here, someone who knew. I grabbed my supplies anyway and returned to the forest. The fog was still thick when I returned, though the eastern sky had begun to crack open with the first silver hints of dawn. I made my way back to the grove as quietly as I could, praying no one had followed. Old Jack met me halfway, tall and restless, every muscle tight. He ushered me quickly to Sarah. She didn't look good, breathing shallowly, eyes barely open. Little Jack held her mother's hand, rocking slightly, a movement I'd seen human children make when frightened. I started working immediately. Clean water, iodine, gauze. The wound responded, bleeding slowed, breathing steadied. Not healed, not safe, but stable. All the while, old Jack watched the tree line. Not me, not Sarah, the forest. He knew danger better than anyone. When I finished, he let out a sound, soft and thankful. Little Jack pressed her forehead gently to Sarah's. The family huddled close, breathing as one. I was about to leave them to rest when a new sound shattered the quiet. A branch crack, sharp and deliberate. 3 shadows came out through the fog, human. They moved with confidence. They carried rifles. Old Jack rose to his full height, a silent wall between danger and family. My heart slammed against my ribs. The hunters had returned. They came out of the fog like ghosts. 3 men in camouflage, rifles held tight to their chests, boots sinking softly into the moss-covered dirt. Their faces were hard, eyes sharp, scanning the grove as though they'd practiced this moment 100 times. The tallest lifted a pair of binoculars, and even through the haze, I knew when he saw old Jack, his breath hitched. "He's there," he whispered. Old Jack didn't roar, didn't threaten, didn't move toward them. He simply stood wide, tall, not moving, placing his body between the hunters and his family. I raised my hands immediately. "Stop! Don't do this!" My voice cracked through the clearing. The men turned their attention to me. Recognition flickered. One of them narrowed his eyes. "McKenna!" I froze. They knew my name. "You've been interfering out here for years?" another said. "Driving people off, flagging reports. Should have known you were hiding something." "You don't understand," I said, palms out. "They're not hostile. They just want to be left alone." "They're animals," the leader replied coldly. "You know how much one of these things is worth." Old Jack made a soft, low sound, not anger, a plea. Little Jack crouched behind him, holding Sarah's hand. "You shoot him," I said, "and you'll prove everything he's ever believed about us." The leader exhaled, steadying his rifle. "We're taking one. Doesn't matter which." I stepped in front of him. "You'll have to shoot me first." For a moment, the forest held its breath. Moss, damp air, distant river, 3 rifles, a family, terrified, silent, a line in the dirt. The leader's jaw clenched. He didn't raise his weapon again, but he didn't lower it either. "Do you think you can stop this?" he hissed. "You've spent your whole career babysitting monsters, but you're one man. Retire, and all this goes away." I kept my voice quiet, steady. "I've watched them raise their child. I've seen them mourn their dead. They feel the world the same way we do. If you wanted proof they were dangerous, you would have had it the moment you stepped into this clearing." Silence. Their rifles pointed just a little less tightly. Behind me, old Jack made a sound, low, deep. I'd heard it only once before, the day he told me of his scars. He took a single step forward, not threatening, standing tall, claiming his right to exist. The hunters hesitated because for a moment they saw him as I did. Not a monster, not a myth. A father, a survivor. The leader finally exhaled, gaze shifting from Jack to the wounded Sarah, then to little Jack, trembling, trying to be brave. He cursed under his breath. "Forget it," he muttered. "They moved deeper. We'll never track them," one of the others protested. "We can mark the spot." "No," the leader cut him off. "We go." And just like that, they turned. They melted back into the fog. No victory celebration, no parting blow, just slowly leaving. When the forest swallowed them, the tension snapped like a cut wire. My legs nearly gave out. Old Jack's head bowed, not in fear, but in gratitude. Sarah breathed easier. Little Jack let out a trembling sigh, touching her father's arm the way children do when they don't have words for relief. I knelt, shaking. "They'll come back," I whispered. "Maybe not today, but someday." You have to go deeper, farther. Old Jack looked toward the mountains, snow-capped shapes beyond the ridgeline, places where humans rarely walk, places even rangers seldom patrol. He understood. He turned to Sarah, then to little Jack. They rose together, leaning into one another, a single shape of family. Before they left, old Jack placed his hand on the cedar trunk, our old gesture, and then on his own chest. Home, self, memory. I copied him, tears blurring my vision. Then he stepped forward and just once rested his massive hand over my heart. A thank you, a goodbye, a passing of the job. They disappeared into the mist, three shadows returning to the ancient world that made them. I never saw them again. I retired in 2016. Sometimes, when hikers file reports of strange sounds in the distance or footprints too large to belong to any bear, I smile because somewhere beyond the places where roads go and maps end, a family still walks beneath the cedars, a living piece of history, quiet, careful, lasting. And though the world never knew their names, I remember them. Old Jack, Sarah, little Jack. I still leave apples on a stump deep in Gifford Pinchot, where moss grows thick and the tree branches cover the sky. They're always gone by morning. Maybe it's deer, maybe it's raccoons, or maybe it's a promise being kept, because some secrets aren't meant to be solved, just honored.